Hello, Labbers. So as promised, today we are going to be doing a deep dive into taking data, which a lot of you guys gave feedback that you felt like the data week last semester just wasn't as strong as it could have been, and you felt like you didn't feel as prepared as you wanted to be. And I hear you. I want to help you guys. So we're going to be doing something a little bit different this time around. So what's great is that now you guys have this kind of theoretical background information on taking data that you guys got last semester. So you have a little bit of experience, and that always makes things easier the second time around. And then this time we're going to be implementing some more real life experiences with videos of actual kids. And so I'll be pausing throughout the video, pausing the recording so that we both can take time to watch the video, take our own data, and meet back and talk about it. So let's go ahead and get started. This is going to be a little bit of a longer video for you guys, and this assignment this week is going to be a little bit longer as well. These couple weeks is where you're getting a lot of your lab hours. So usually you get like an hour per assignment, and this time you're getting like 2 or 3 hours for this assignment because it is going to take a little bit longer because you're going to be watching these videos and you might have to pause throughout them to take your data. So I wanted to give you guys some leniency and give you a little bit of extra time to do this assignment. All right, so this slide has a lot of information on it. It's just kind of a review of what we talked about last semester with just the overview of information. So basically, there's a couple of different kinds of data. So there's observational data or qualitative data, which is where it's usually subjective, but it can be objective. The reason why, so qualitative data is not objective, it's subjective. But the reason why observational data could be objective rather than subjective is if you are observing somebody play and then you're going to take note of like how many times they did something, right? So typically though, it's just going to be kind of a description like they were engaging with their peers and or they weren't engaging with their peers, they never made eye contact, and they didn't join any social groups, right? That could be an observation. Or you could be watching them play and say they walked up to a group 3 times throughout recess. So that's going to be, even though it's observational, it's going to be quantitative, but typically it's going to be more qualitative and subjective. Um, so watching a kid play at recess or at lunch to see how they interact with their peers. This is a really big one for social pragmatic kids, kids with autism, but also for kids who might stutter, for example, if they have more disfluency in different settings. It can be really beneficial to see how often their disfluencies occur in sessions with you versus with their friends versus in class. And then getting that observational data combined with their information that they can relay to you can be very beneficial. That's going to be typically in older kids, though, not in preschool, because developmental disfluencies usually kind of putter away. You'll see a lot of stuttering in preschool, but it's typically just kind of transient because they're learning so much language, and then as they grow, it will stop. But again, something to keep an eye on, not something to just dismiss immediately. It can also be, yeah, watching a kid in the classroom to see participation in large group versus small group, if there's any difference there, seeing how they participate, how they do their work, are they, even just seeing how they organize themselves. So when they're doing their work, do they have a ton of stuff out on their desk, or are they just focusing on their work? Are they going through the questions in order, or are they skipping around a bunch? How much are they asking for help? How much are they asking help from their teacher versus their peers? And just really seeing what they're doing and writing up exactly like, okay, they were doing this, and I think this could be related to their language because of this. Um, and then also taking note of any kids that you see that might be having some abnormalities that's not on your caseload. You might want to, as you're observing one kid, maybe you see another kid that's, you're supposed to be observing this kid's language, and then you see this other kid that's not making any eye contact, not interacting with peers at all, sitting in the corner alone of the classroom. You could go up to the teacher and be like, hey, like, is this typical behavior that you're noticing? And maybe the teacher says, oh no, they're having a bad day. And you can say, okay. Or maybe the teacher's like, yeah, it's kind of weird. I didn't want to say anything. And then you might want to come back and observe another day or two just to get more information and maybe want to assess that kid. You could also do something called RTI, which is where you can push into a classroom and work along with the teacher in small groups and large groups to kind of provide support to all students and just continually assess all the students and see how their progress is, and then kind of decide, okay, does this kid need more one-on-one time with me, or are they starting to catch up with their peers just with this RTI kind of approach? And then also the kid that you're actually observing, you should be comparing with the teacher to see, like, is this a typical day for them, or are they behaving differently than usual? And then again, try to do it over a variety of days, at least two, if not three, just to kind of make sure that it is typical behavior, and um, compare your notes to themselves. And then again, the quantitative data is usually objective, but can be subjective. So again, that's kind of what I meant earlier with the example of at recess. How many times did they go up to somebody? That's quantitative data, but it's still just like an observation. It's going to be numerical data, and it's going to be the number of items completed. So usually that's going to be reported as a percentage, but it can also be a number. So it could be, they exhibited no disfluencies in a 5-minute conversation, or it could be um, there's a couple here, they did it this times out of this times, which is this percent. So a non-language example would be, if I shoot a basketball 10 times, I make it in the hoop 8 times. That means that you made it 8 out of 10 times, that's 80%. Similarly, a speech goal, which I think the reason why I bring up speech goals is just because I think it's easier to understand a speech goal, because it is a lot more objective than subjective. Um, so if I pronounce 10 words that start with R, and I accurately produce R in 6 times of those 10, your production accuracy is 60%, right? Versus a language goal, which is, if I'm asked 10 WH questions, who, what, when, where, why, and I respond appropriately 9 times, my accuracy is 90%. One reason why I don't like the 10 WH questions example is because, for example, you could ask 8 who questions and 2 what questions, and say they're really good at who questions and they get all of them right. Then that doesn't give you information on how they're doing with where questions. So you would maybe want to, at least in your data, put like 10 WH questions each or something like that, or provide or answer each WH question with 80% accuracy when you're right. I mean, now I'm switching over to goals. Sorry if this is confusing. But if you are writing a goal with something like this, you're going to want to signify that there's a difference between WH questions, because they are different. Why questions are a lot more challenging to answer than who questions. And so you don't want to inaccurately remove a kid from your caseload because they meet their goal, but really it's just they're really good at who questions. So you want to make sure that when you're taking data, you're appropriately breaking up, okay, I asked 5 who, 5 what, 5 when, or whatever. And so then even if it's not officially for their goal, at least in your SOAP notes, you have it listed out. Okay, they're answering who questions with 90% accuracy, what with 90% accuracy, when with 70, where with 70, and why with 50. And then you can kind of adjust for yourself, like what kind of support you need to give for each kind of question. And then once they're reaching the really high accuracy for who and what, you can kind of stop focusing on that and start focusing on the other three kinds of WH questions, until that accuracy kind of goes up. And then just every once in a while, add in a who and what question just to keep them in the right mindset for those so they don't regress at all. So if you are going to make a goal like that, make sure that in your own data, you're really breaking up what you're doing, because that's going to help you a lot if the parents ever ask questions or the teachers. So you can pull out your data and be like, hey, this is exactly what they're doing for each kind of question, if it ever comes to that. So a couple of different ways to get data. Observation, you could go to the classroom, observe during a lot of different kinds of activities, different days, at lunch and recess. You could give a questionnaire to teachers, parents, babysitter, whoever's interacting with the child to get more information about the child's ability in the classroom and at home. This is especially beneficial for bilingual children to kind of get a sense of how often they're using one language versus another, what kind of vocabulary is used in one language versus another. So one example one of my professors gave me in undergrad is she is Spanish English bilingual. At home, she only ever spoke Spanish, and at school, she only ever spoke English, other than like Spanish class or whatever when she was older. And she told us a story about how she didn't know the name for mop in English when she was like in her 20s, and somebody was talking about a mop to her and she was like what is that? Like I have no idea. But then she knew the word immediately in Spanish. And the reasoning for that is because she had never been in a context where she needed to know the English word for mop, because at school typically you don't have mops. Like you might have like little like pusher vacuums, or whatever, for sometimes kids help clean the room, but you usually don't have mops. And so she'd never been exposed to that word before, and so it's just interesting sometimes to have a questionnaire to see what kind of vocabulary the child's using at home. In their native language, are they putting together, 3-word utterances, but in English they're only using one word at a time? That can be indicative of a difference, not a disorder, right? So if they're using their native language completely normally, and then they're having trouble in English, it could be just because they're learning English and it takes time. Or they could be showing difficulties in both languages, and then you're able to say, oh, okay, this is probably a disorder. They're having the same issue in both languages. In both languages, they're only using one word at a time. And so that can be really helpful information to have. But it can be beneficial for anything. I've had a few students who just had really low language, and we were trying to come up with a lesson plan. I was working with the parents. They were early intervention kids, so little tiny babies. And it was just really beneficial to get information using the MacArthur-Bates, which is a questionnaire, to see what kind of language the parents were using at home, what they thought their child was understanding, what they thought their child was starting to produce, and just getting some more information that way so that we were able to kind of mold our help to what the child already understood and kind of build off of that. um, it's just very interesting information. Questionnaires, I like them. Standardized testing. Oh, another note I'll make about questionnaires. They're great because they give you a lot of information without wasting your time. And what I mean by that is that giving a standardized test can take hours, especially for a little kid, because you can't just do it all at once. They're not going to sit down for like an hour-long test. You're going to have to do it in chunks, maybe over multiple sessions, to get that information. Versus a questionnaire, you can have the parent fill it out while you're doing testing. So that way the parent's not just like sitting there on their phone, and it's not wasting your time. Like you're not sitting there with the parent having, usually you should sit with them and explain the questionnaire and be available if they have questions at all. But you're not having to like sit there for the whole hour working with them. You can be working with the child and assessing them while the questionnaire is getting done. So then you can get that data and just add it to your group of other data as well, which I find extremely beneficial. You can't beat it. Standardized testing, again, it's where you're going to give a test that has been normed on a similar population. So, for example, the I can't even think of a test right now. GIFTA, for example, the Goldman-Bristow, it's a test of articulation, and it has a ton of words and the child and pictures, and the child just has to say what the picture is. You don't give any help, you don't give any support. You just show them the picture, you point to it, and you're like, what is this? And then the child will say, ball. And then you'll write down in phonetics, ball, how they produced it. And then you can compare their production to a correct production. And then based off of all of their scores, you compare them to a group of normally developing children that have taken the test, and their results, and how do they compare to these normal children. So for example, the people who develop the test will give the test to 100 kids, and place them on a bell curve, and then all the other kids who take this test will be placed in comparison to that 100 kids who took the test, and were normed for it. And so if they score within, one standard deviation of the mean, then they're doing really normally, like they're performing as expected. If they're performing way above, great, that's awesome. They're like perfect angels. If they're performing way below, then that means that they probably need some support, right? For whatever reason. And then criteria, so that's why standardized testing is great, because it gives you a number of, okay, this kid is performing normally, like they're performing the same as their peers, they probably don't need help. But if they score really low, then you can say, hey, they scored really low in comparison to their peers, like they need some help, they need some support. And that's why insurance companies and schools and hospitals like standardized testing, because it gives you a set number of, hey, this kid needs help or doesn't need help. And there's a cutoff line. And if they're below the cutoff line, they get help. And if they're above the cutoff line, they don't get help. Guess why that sucks? Because if a kid's on the border and they're still performing really low, but not low enough, they're not going to get help and they're still going to keep struggling. And so that's where these other kinds of testing come into play. So, yes, standardized testing is important, it has a place, but you need to supplement it with other kinds of data. You can't just take standardized testing at face value. And a lot of people, unfortunately, that's kind of been the precedent for a long time. And it's really positive that that's changing now. So you can also do criterion testing, which is also a test, but it's not normed on a similar population, and you can adjust it for the child. So standardized testing, if you adjust it at all, it's no longer valid as a standardized test. It turns into a criterion test, right? Because the normed population didn't get that version. But criterion testing, you can make your own test, you can adjust other tests, you can use a test that's on like Teachers Pay Teachers or whatever, and to get more information about what you want for that specific child, which is great. Dynamic testing is a wonderful way to test. It's also called like a test, teach, retest approach. So this can be used in a variety of different contexts for language, vocabulary, story retell, stimulability for phonemes, whatever. And it is the best way to test bilingual children. And the reason for that is because it can kind of give you information on whether this is a difference or a disability. So if you, like I was saying earlier, like the mop thing in English, like as soon as she learned that the English word was mop, she now knew that the English word was mop. She just needed to be told that. And so if you're giving like a vocabulary test to a child who is not a native English speaker and they do really poorly on the standardized test, it could just be because they've never been exposed to that vocabulary before. And so by using the information from that standardized test combined with a questionnaire from the parents, combined with dynamic testing where you do a fast mapping activity, you can determine like, okay, they performed really poorly on the standardized test, but then the mom speaks 100% French at home. And during dynamic testing, they learned new English words in like 1 minute. So you're able to say like, okay, this is probably just like an English language learner. And so they probably don't need speech services, but could benefit from push-in, like RTI. And so this, like I said, could be used in a variety of ways. So sometimes they'll do this for speech sound disorders. So if a child is not producing any clusters at all, clusters being like two consonants right next to each other. So like brush, like the BR, that's two consonants, that's a cluster. So maybe the child always says bush, bush. And so by being like, okay, watch me, like watch what I'm going to do, brush, and kind of teaching the child how to do it, and then testing them again and seeing if they can produce it for a different word. You can see like, okay, like, are they able to learn this or are they struggling? If they're able to learn this, they're probably going to learn it on their own and don't need help. If they're not able to, they probably are going to need help. So that's one way to kind of like weed out kids for that. But again, this can be used for lots of different things. For language, vocabulary, story retell, you can like lay out picture cards and see how they do the first time and then teach them story structure and be like, okay, well, when I tell a story, I do this and this and this, and let me show you how to do a story. And then you give them an example and then you give them different picture cards and have them do it again with a different story. And if they're able to implement all of the stuff that you just taught them, then they probably aren't going to need support. But if they are still making the same mistakes as before, even with your explicit teaching of this, then they're going to need help. So I love dynamic testing. I really highly encourage you to try it if you ever get the opportunity. Language sample is get the child talking. You typically will record it because it's really hard to transcribe in person. I've tried before for fluency clients and it's very challenging. So yeah, use recorder, get the child talking, and then later on you're going to write down or type out exactly what the child has said, exactly what you said, and then you're going to go through and code it. So you're going to add in like certain symbols into the sentences to signify different meanings of things. So for example, if they repeat themselves, you put that in parentheses because that's not like a novel thing. It's just them, like your brain thinking through itself, like, oh, that's a frog. They didn't really mean like that's a frog. So you just kind of like code depending on that. You also code for morphemes, which again, if you forget, is kind of like the suffixes usually. So you put like a slash to signify, okay, here's the base word, here's the combined morpheme. And typically when you're measuring MLU, you can do it in a couple of different ways. You can do it with just the words, or you can do it with the morphemes. And the morpheme is going to give you more deep information because you can see how the child is using grammar, how many errors they're making on grammar. And it's a really great way to see how the child is actually using language in real life versus standardized testing is just not natural. And language sampling is a lot more natural. So you can get this data a variety of ways. You could have them retell a story. You could have them tell a new story, like, what's your favorite movie? And they can just tell you about it. You can talk about their day, something they're interested in, just whatever you want, really. It just depends on what data you kind of want to get. So yeah, these are all the different ways that you can get data. There's a lot of different ways. They have pros and cons. Usually wherever your place is going to require some kind of standardized testing, but you really should supplement that with a battery of tests, which means a variety of different things, including usually, if you can, every person should have a language sample or a speech sample if you can. And then Definitely questionnaires are so beneficial. I love them. I love them. Okay. So a couple of things to include when you're taking data is what observations you notice. So when you're taking observations, write down what are they saying it, how are they saying it, how are they interacting with others. So like how's their body language? Are they using gestures? Are they making eye contact? Side note, a lot of the times children with ASD are written goals to maintain eye contact, and I personally hate that because think about it. When you're talking with somebody, like, do you constantly make eye contact with them? Like, no, like sometimes you're multitasking and you're like writing or texting or something while somebody's talking to you, and you're still able to like be like, oh, yeah, yeah, okay. So eye contact is not like the most important goal, and it actually can be very not great because if you are always pushing for eye contact, then it becomes unnatural. And then the child is always staring at the person they're talking to constantly like this, and it can make people uncomfortable. And then it's confusing for them when you're like, whoa, okay, too much eye contact. So that's just a little segue there. But how they are interacting with others. Are they maintaining topic? Are they asking questions about other people's interests, or are they only talking about something that they like? How are they using language? Are they only making comments, or are they asking questions and making negations? What kind of things are they talking about? What kind of vocabulary are they using? Are they only using nouns? Are they using nouns and verbs? Are they using nouns and verbs and adjectives? How are they combining them together? All of those things can just be written down observations. And you might turn it into more of a like a quantitative thing if you notice that they're usually using only nouns, but then sometimes they're using nouns with verbs. You might start checking like, okay, they made just noun, just noun, just noun, noun and verb, noun and verb, noun and verb. And so you can kind of get data that way as well. Also counting the number of correct and incorrect productions of what you're measuring. So for assessment, this is going to be a wide variety of things. It's whatever that child needs. And it's going to be, like I said, in a battery of tests. So if there's a language problem, you're usually going to be doing more than just one assessment. So you might be doing like a standardized assessment, like the PLS. And then you might also be using the MacArthur Bates to go along with that. Those are two. So the PLS is a standardized test that measures language in preschoolers. And then the MacArthur Bates is a questionnaire that you can give to caregivers or teachers to get information about their vocabulary. So for assessment, you're going to be measuring a ton of different things. You're going to be measuring, you know, what kind of language they're using, all of the things that I just said. And then for treatment, your data is going to be more kind of tunneled, right? Tunnel vision. Because for assessment, you're kind of looking at all of the ways that they're using language and all of the things that they possibly could have wrong, so that you can kind of come up with a goal based on their strengths and weaknesses. So you want to know everything about the kid. What are they good at? What are they not good at? Because you can use what they're good at to help bring up what they're missing. Versus for treatment, you're going to have a goal written and you're going to want to be taking data pretty much just on their goal or any informal goals. So, for example, I had a client this semester who was working on a lot of things, honestly. But one of the things he was working on was backing. And so, or fronting. So he would say, instead of okay, he would say ote. And that obviously is not appropriate, especially because he was in middle school. And so our data was mostly on, okay, how many times is he correctly using a K or a G? How many times is he incorrectly using a T or a D instead of a K or a G? But he also had an informal goal of rhyming, because he was really struggling with that, which in middle school you shouldn't be. And so even though his formal goal was to work on his production, we also would tie in rhyming words. So we would come up with a word like rag that ends with a G. And then he would have to come up with rhymes of that. So like rag, bag, wag. and it helped target not only his formal goal of producing K and G in correct context, but it also helped informally target something he was struggling with. So even though he didn't have an official goal for rhyming, we knew he struggled with that. And so we were able to use that as kind of our um, like basis for doing the K and G. So in his head, he knows he's working on K and G, but he's doing it in a rhyming setting. So we're kind of targeting both, even though that wasn't a formal goal, if that makes sense. And you'll see that a lot in the schools, especially with older kids. I know I had a lot of kids who their formal goal was inferencing, but we also worked on vocabulary, like complex vocabulary, and learning how to um, figure out what a definition of a word was using the context of a sentence. So, for example, we would give them a paragraph and they would have to read it. And in the paragraph, we would have one or two words highlighted. And so the main goal was to read the paragraph and answer inferencing questions. But then we would also have them go back and look at the words and be like, okay, so what do you think melancholy means? Which is a really complex word that they've never heard before. And even though that wasn't their formal goal, we would still have it embedded in the paragraph. And it was almost kind of an inferencing skill, right? Because you have to use the context clues around it. You have to kind of use your background knowledge of, okay, what kind of word would fit there. And so even though it wasn't a direct goal, it's something that we still targeted because we knew it would benefit them. And it was easily combined in with their formal goal, right? It wasn't like we were going out of our way to, instead of focusing on their goal, be like, okay, we already talked about inferencing, but now we're going to talk about vocabulary. Like it was just something that went along with it, which can be beneficial and might warrant data. That's where I was going with that story. It was kind of a long tangent, I'm sorry. But yeah, so that's, you might take data on, for example, the middle schooler, like how often is this kid rhyming? Even though that wasn't a formal goal, it's something that we kind of took data on just to see if he was improving at all with the informal treatment. Are they on the right track? So yeah, like, are they meeting their goal? Are they not meeting their goal? That's more for treatment, not assessment, because for assessment, there is no I mean, there is like if they're performing within normal limits, then yeah, I guess they're on track. But that's more for treatment. Like, are they on track to meet their goal? Usually, with a long-term goal, you'll have one or two short-term goals, which are really great to have in between. So, if a goal is a year long, it can be really nice to have a check-in, like at winter break, and be like, okay, so at the end of the year, we want them doing this. By winter break, we want them at this point. So then you can kind of have like a check-in with yourself of, okay, like, are they doing it? Am I giving them the support they need? What do I need to change to help get them back on track to meet their overall goal? And then what kind of cues did you give and how many? So again, we talked a little bit last semester about the types of cues you can use, which are visual, verbal, tactile, and then also the number of cues that you give. So did they do it by themselves? That would be independent. Did they need one prompt? That's minimum. Did they need two or three? That's moderate. Did they need more than that? Did you basically have to give them the answer? That's maximal cues. And so when we're writing goals, we typically are writing it for independence or with minimal prompts. And if you are giving them more prompts, it's usually a stepping stone, like a short-term goal, in order to reach the longer term goal. And then for assessment, you really shouldn't be giving cues unless it's in dynamic assessment, because you want to get their true baseline. Like, how are they actually performing without any help? So that's going to be like the standardized testing, criterion testing. You're not going to give them help. But then for dynamic testing, you are going to have that teaching part. But even for both the test parts, you should be giving help, right? So when you test, you're not helping them at all. And then you're teaching them, you're giving them all the support you can. And then when you retest, you're not going to be giving them cues while they're answering, because you want to see, like, did they actually improve just based off of that teaching? So yeah, but for treatment, definitely write down what kind of cues you're giving, how many, um, and yeah. Okay. So the way that you're going to be keeping track of all of this is with something called SOAP notes, which I think I mentioned earlier without any context. So I apologize for that. SOAP notes are basically like a daily little blurb about how the student is doing. It's like a little mini progress note. And it can help you because you're able to, when you have a ton of clients, it's really hard to keep track of everybody and what they were working on and what they're going to work on next and all of that kind of stuff. And so it can be really helpful to just have it written down like, this is what happened that day. This is how they did. These are some notes for last week or for next week. So then when you're lesson planning at the end of the week for the next week, you can be like, okay, I promised the kids that I would show this clip at the end, or I didn't get through this article. And so I need to finish this article before we move on to something new. So it's kind of just jogging your memory, especially for the plan part. And then the objective and assessment is kind of just keeping track of the cold, hard data so that you can see how they're doing over time. And subjective is just notes about that day. Because, for example, if they do really, really bad that day, um, or really, really good, the subjective can just help you jog your memory of like what happened. So, for example, I had a kid who um, like had a cold one day and she didn't get a lot of sleep and she was super moody and she did just awful, just straight up got like 0% accuracy that day. And so if I were to like chart her progress on a graph, it would be like 60%, 65, 70, 0, 60, right? And so it can help just give explanation for what's going on with just the straight numbers. Um, so when you're writing SOAP notes, there's four parts. Subjective is any observations you noted. How was their participation? How was their attitude? Was there anything that could have impacted their performance? Did the teacher or mom or whoever, dad, parents, I'm so sorry that I wrote mom there. That was very sexist of me. Did the teacher or caregiver let you know anything important? And that's all just really great information. I've had, caregivers tell me, hey, like, the kids' parents are going through a divorce right now, like they're really struggling, or they are having a hard time in school and it's really impacting their motivation to work on speech goals, or whatever. It can just really give more depth to the information you have, but also just the participation and attitude in general. Sometimes there's not a big reason why they're in a bad mood. Sometimes they just are. And even as adults, we experience that. And I always have patience with kids because I have had bad days too. And I've had days where I don't want to participate in class and I don't. And I can get away with that because I'm in college and there's other people for the teacher to call on, but they can't get away with it because they're either in a small group or in one on one therapy and they are expected to participate. And so sometimes if it just happens every once in a while, you can write, they were in a bad mood today. They didn't have great participation. Sorry. If it's happening consistently, that's something that you guys need to be focusing on and figuring out what's the problem. How can we turn this around? But if it's something that just happens every once in a while, it is what it is. Objective is just straight numbers of what the goal is or informal goal is, how they're doing. If it's a speech goal, you're going to want to talk about if they're working on S, for example, like how are they doing with initial, medial, final S? Is it in words, sentences, conversational speech? What their production accuracy is for each of those different things. Um, if it's for language, same thing. I mentioned earlier the WH question. So how many, who, what, where, when, why, and have that all like charted out, not charted, but graphed, or at least just organized in a way that gives you information about what exactly it is you're measuring and how much support you are giving. Assessment is going to be combining the subjective and objective to explain why their performance is the way it was, what was helpful, what was unhelpful. So for example, I had a kid who really benefited from movement, like during the sessions. So she had been struggling at the beginning. And when I found out that if I let her run, if I let her run, her performance really improved. And so I just kind of marked that in there like, hey, her performance increased from 45% to 75% when a physical activity was implemented. So any considerations that you think should be included in there, and then the plan is what is going to happen for next week. So it may include if you were working on a like list of words, what word you left off on. If you're working on an article, where you left off on that. Um, if you need to move up or down your support level. So maybe they're really struggling and you need to give a little bit more support, or maybe they're doing great and you need to like give a little bit less support, or have more difficulty. So maybe they're doing really great answering the concrete and subjective questions. And so maybe you're going to add in more abstract questions. Any materials you promised, like I said, this is really common. If you like promise to play a song next week or read a certain book, um, kids remember even if you don't, and they get really excited about it. So yeah, make sure you write that down or else they're going to be really bummed. I also will include on there like birthdays. So I'll get students' birthdays at the beginning of the year and make sure that I include it in the plan. Like, oh, their birthday week is next week, and make sure that we like make sure they feel really special. And any other notes you want to remember. Like maybe you need to ask the parent something, ask the teacher something. That would all go in the plan. So here's an example of a SOAP note that is a real SOAP note that I wrote. I'm not going to tell you when, and I'm not going to tell you who. I am going to tell you it was a preschool aged client who was working on a speech goal. And so here we have, this was at the beginning of the semester, and I'm going to show you one at the end of the semester as well. So subjective, the client showed up on time and was excited for her session. She performed best doing physical games such as elephant and an action spinner. So this is the same client I was just talking about, if that wasn't clear. So obviously I chose to put that in the subjective. Objective, so she was working on S, SH, and Z, and all in the initial position. I will tell you this was at the word level. Usually at the preschool age, it's going to be at the word level. And so here you can see that when she was doing S, she was doing with 88% accuracy. With SH, she was doing it with 60% accuracy. And with Z, she was doing it with 50% accuracy. With J, so like jump, it's like the J sound, she was doing with 44% accuracy. And then final, so she had like a bunch of different goals, and we'll talk about this client a little bit more in a minute, or in the goal lecture next week. We'll talk a lot more about her because she's just so fun. But yeah, she had a couple different goals. So the first one was differentiating between S, SH, and Z. The next one was J, and then final consonant deletion. She was only including the last sound of a word 40% of the time. So she was pretty consistently leaving off the final sound like of every word. So that was all the objective data. That's how she did. And then assessment, I said she responds well with a combination of visual and verbal cues. For Ja, she was able to produce the sound when the clinician made the sound and showed the client the inside of the clinician's mouth, followed by the client's mouth with a mirror. When producing S, Z, and SH, she was able to correct her sound when asked which one. So for this, that shows what cues helped her, what cues might not have helped her. It showed exactly what support I'm giving her. So if another SLP had to pick up this client off of my caseload, they would be able to look at this and see, okay, this is kind of where she's at. I should have added in here. I told you in the introduction to this semester, I told you I'd roast myself and let you know my mistakes. If I was doing this again, I would include the word level and I would include the prompting probably here as well. The assessment, I probably would include a little bit more information as well about exactly what kind of activities I was doing along with these. So here I said that I made the sound ja and showed the client my mouth and then showed her her mouth when she made it, I would probably make that a lot more clear. Like, was I giving her a word or were we just saying ja? Did we practice doing ja in the mirror and then her word improved? Like, and then asked her to do words and that improved. I would give more information because reading this now, I'm confused. Like, I don't know what that session looked like, and I did it. So, and then finally, when producing this, asked which one. That's also not clear to me because was I showing her a word and I asked what sound the word was going to be, or did she say the word and I asked her and then she corrected herself? So I would make that a little bit more clear. Plan, the client should continue to work on final consonant deletion, SZ, SH, and JA. W and R should no longer continue to be targets. This decision was made due to the importance of the other three goals to the client's intelligibility and generalizing. I hate that sentence. That is awful. So there's no context here, but in the previous couple of SOAP notes, again, this was at the beginning of the semester, she had been assessed for, she was making the W sound instead of R. And the reason why we chose not to target that is because she was in preschool and it's really common for preschoolers to make a W instead of an R. That's not something that normally would be a concern that a speech therapist would target at all. And the reality of the situation is that this client had really low intelligibility. It was very hard to understand her. And the reason why it was hard to understand her was not because she was using W for R. It was mostly because she was leaving off the last sound of every single word that she was saying. I can't even do an example because it would be way too hard for me to do. But yeah, just imagine if you were only hearing half of every word somebody made, like, yeah, that would impact the intelligibility. And so that's the reason why final consonant deletion was selected, and then ja was selected because of the complexity theory, which is where you should target the hardest sounds to make and it will generalize to the easier sounds. So by teaching her ja, in theory, it's going to also impact her production of all these other sounds, because she did have quite a few sounds in error. And I'll talk about this next week, but if I was going to see this client again, I would not have chosen these goals. I would have chosen something else, and I'll talk more about that next week. But yes, okay, moving on. So this is an example of a SOAP note that she had at the end of the semester. So for subjective, we have client, mom, and sister showed up on time. She was excited and ready to work. During the final conference, the mom noted progress had been seen at home and expressed that she is excited for future progress. So that's really great to see. It's something that I think is very important that I included in here, is that she's seeing progress at home, which shows that the skills are generalizing, and also that she's excited for future progress, shows that the mom is happy with therapy, versus if the mom is like, well, I'm seeing progress at home, but like, I don't know, it's not that much. Then you would, maybe do another interview and see like, well, what progress are you seeing? What do you think needs to be changed? That's always a really great check-in point, to get parent input. But her mom was the sweetest human. Let's see, objective. You can see here that I broke down now, initial, medial, and final. So you see huge progress from, the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester. We have Z, S, and SH, almost 100% accuracy at all places in the word. Again, this is at the word level, which I would, if I was going to rewrite this SOAP note, specify. And then final consonant deletion, she improved to 90%, from 40%. So huge increase there. That made a huge impact on her intelligibility. Honestly, it was insane. And then Ja, you see she didn't make quite as much progress, because that was that my dog's having a nightmare. I'm sorry if you can hear that. The ja is a complex sound, and the reason why we were targeting it is because it is a sound that comes in usually later in life. It's very hard to produce, and the reason why we were targeting it is because it would make, just by targeting that, it makes her production of easier sounds better, even if you don't target them. And so we weren't expecting her to reach 100% accuracy for ja because it's a hard sound, and So seeing this number of 85% for initial, that's awesome. And like we didn't even really target medial and final. So the fact that she did improve is great. And that's something that she's going to continue to improve upon, which we can project because of her improvement of all of these other areas. And also because her initial jumped from like what 40% to 85, and we mostly were targeting initial. So we can assume that the medial and final will come in on its own. And then assessment. Client readily self-corrects. She is aware when people do not understand what she is saying and attempts to make conversational repairs. I probably would include also more information about any cues I was giving her because these numbers are so high. Um, I wish that I had information on, is this independent? Is this with one cue or fewer? But I love that I included information about her self-correction and her conversational repairs. This was a really big breaking point towards the end of the semester where this client kind of had this like come to Jesus moment of, hey, like people sometimes don't understand what I'm saying and it makes me sad. And she's told me that one week. And I said, well, like, why are you sad? And she says, well, I don't like having to repeat myself. And like, I don't like when people don't like want to hear what I have to say and they just kind of brush me off, like obviously she's in preschool. It wasn't like said that way, but essentially that was the conversation. And I was like, well, that's why you're here and you're improving. Like at the beginning of the semester, it was hard to understand you. Like I didn't understand you very well, but now you've been working so hard and I understand pretty much everything you say to me. And I love that I can understand you. Like I'm very proud of you. And I was like, you should be proud of yourself too. And by the end of the semester, she had kind of come over that moment and she was able to she showed huge progress after that session where she confided in me. And I think she realized then that I'm making improvements and if I keep working hard at this people will understand me. And so she by the end of the semester, as I said here, readily self-corrects. She understands when people don't understand what she's saying and she tries to fix it. So she would say the word again using the strategies we talked about, or she would say a different word. If the person wasn't understanding the word she was trying to say, she would try to come up with a different word, which is a super advanced skill. Like this kid was impressive. But yeah, this is an example of a really great thing to include in assessment. And then plan, continue working on final consonant deletion and generalization. The reason that was the plan is because there was like one more week left and we had already had the final conference. There wasn't really much left to work on. And yeah, oh, I love this client. I miss her. She's doing very well, by the way. She ended up getting discharged from therapy um, very shortly after this and is completely intelligible now and doing great in life. She is a happy, healthy elementary schooler now. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pause recording right now. I'm going to make lunch because it's lunchtime for me. And then I have watched all three of these videos and taken data on all of them. I'm going to pause here. I'm going to let you watch these videos at your own pace. I want you to pause the videos as much as you need, take whatever data you think is appropriate. It can be observational or numbers. Yeah, whatever you think is going to be best. Some of these are assessment, some of them are treatment, some of them are observation. Yeah, I marked that right here. So this one is an assessment of a girl's use of language in categories. This one is treatment for language and expanding utterances. And this one is an observation of a classroom math lesson, which is very cute and sweet. And so I will pause and then I'll come back with my thoughts and we'll be able to compare a little bit. 1 minute, I'm trying to get my Zoom thing up here. All right, I'll be right back. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into this a little bit while my lunch cooks. Okay, so the first video that we watched was the language and categories video, and I chose to take data on the following things. So every time she named an object, every time she placed the object in the correct category, every time she correctly named the category, every time she uh, understood something, like used her receptive vocabulary, like I think she said like point to the octopus or something. She every time she was able to do that, she got a point. Following directions, there were two-step directions, and then answering WH questions. So obviously, majority of the data was taken with naming the object, placing the object into the correct category, and then naming the category. So that's where most of the data is going to be. So for naming the object, she correctly named it in 6 out of 7 opportunities, which is 86%. She placed the category in 7 out of 7 opportunities, which is 100%, and named the category in 7 out of 7 opportunities, which is 100%. Her receptive vocabulary was also at 100, following directions at 100, and answering the WH question was 100. And for data taking purposes, the first 3 are going to be more reliable data than the last 3 because 2 opportunities isn't the most um, reliable. um, but if she appears to be following all of those things, typically after she does it a couple times, you're like, okay, she's got this. And so this student, I would say, would not qualify for services, or if she's currently in services, she probably would qualify to be dismissed if this was her goal, because she is appropriately doing everything almost perfectly. If this was a case where her goal was written for over 3 sessions, then this would be a check towards that. Um, and if this was an assessment, I would say that she would not qualify because she is performing at an age appropriate level. So I'm going to actually pause again to get my lunch and I will be right back. If you didn't do the second video yet, go ahead and take this time to do so. Okay, I'm back again. Let's go ahead and talk about the second video now. So there's lots going on in this video. If you felt overwhelmed, you aren't alone. I definitely had to pause and go back. I watched it twice just to double check myself. So let's walk through all of this together. So this child is fronting. So that means that I talked about my other client who is backing. This is the opposite. So instead of saying K and G, he's saying T and D. So given maximal cues, so this clinician was giving this child the most, he still only did it 1 time correctly, and the other 3 times was incorrect. For alveolarization, it was 33%, so they did it 2 times when they could have done it 6. So I counted 6 times where they used this and didn't. For initial SH, they did it correctly both times, 100%. WH questions, just 1 time, 100%. Maximal cues, because she gave him the answer. Pronouns, 2 times, 100%. Maximal cues, again. And then expanding utterances. Okay, so this child I wrote down all of this and it seems like a lot, but there's a reason why I did it, and I wrote a summary. So when this child was producing utterances, because one of the goals was expanding his utterances, it was 5 with maximal cues. So the clinician was essentially saying she went to the store, right? And then they did it a few times like that, right? 5 with maximal cues, 5 with maximal cues, 5 with maximal cues, 4 with maximal cues. And then he made an utterance that was 3 words by himself. So she didn't say anything to him to cue him, and he did it by himself, which is awesome. And then there was another couple where 4 with maximal cues, 5 with maximal cues, and then he made a sentence that was 5 words long by himself, which is awesome. I wrote independent, woo! And then 3 with max Qs, another independent one, six or another 3 with max Qs, and then a 6 independent one. And so basically, I took all of this data and his average. So I think there were like, what, one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight instances of the max queuing that the clinician was doing with him. Um, and his average was 4.25 words when he was given maximal queuing. And then he did 4.75 independently. So if you were just to look at this data, it would appear like he's doing better on his own than he is with the maximal cues. But note that without the maximal cues, that would be way lower, right? Like he wouldn't have the support and the model in order to make those longer sentences. And also, those sentences were about things that he was interested in and wanted to comment upon versus the sentences that she was giving him were sentences that included things that he needed to work on, including like WH and pronouns. And it looked like they were also working on vocabulary quite a bit. And so, yeah, I think that just looking at that data by itself is misleading. Um, I also put a note. I did not catch every single utterance because in some instances they're talking over each other. And also in the real world, it's not realistic to be able to write down every single thing that a client says unless you're taking a language sample, of course. And so in this instance, I gave myself some grace and I wrote down the obvious utterances. His independent ones, I think I caught all of them, but probably not. And if you didn't get this exact same data, that's okay, as long as we're in kind of the same ballpark. That's just kind of how data goes because some of it is subjective and there is clinician error that happens. I did want to make a comment, and I even wrote it out under the slide. I remember when I was making this PowerPoint about prefacing who Nancy Kaufman is. So the clinician who is in this video is actually just this amazing, amazing woman. So she's an expert in the field at working with childhood apraxia of speech, which is a disorder where it's not just like a speech disorder where they're putting their tongue in the wrong place. It's something that stems from the brain, and their brain just can't plan how to make the speech sounds. So it's not a production problem, it's like a planning problem. And so it's pretty uncommon and kind of controversial in the field just because a lot of people will say, oh, that's child apraxia of speech without it actually being that. And it also, people just don't know how to treat it very well. And so there's a lot of controversy that goes around with it, I guess. But anyway, this woman specializes in that and she's awesome. And she makes all these resources. And I wanted to mention them just because, yeah, look, I have so much stuff in here. Wow, maybe I'll just share this for you guys. But yeah, she makes these Kaufman cards. And essentially what they are is they're like, Pippa, no, they're like picture cards that are broken up by word shape. And so what I mean by that is like a word that's a CV word, a consonant vowel word is like ba, uh, d, toe, like words that have a consonant and then a vowel. And then there's the opposite where it's a vowel and then a consonant, like odd or ope. um, and then of course there can be lots of different shapes. So there's CVC, which would be like car, right? Because it's like CAR. It could also be CVCV, which would be like baby. But even with that, there's some variability because you could have the same consonants and the same vowels that are reduplicated, like baba, or you could have them be different, like baby. And so she breaks it up so beautifully, and it's perfect because you can select exactly what kind of word you want, and you can use it for kids that are not even childhood apraxia of speech kids. I've worked on it with minimally verbal clients before, and they really just help you scaffold the vocab because it goes from like easier to pronounce words to harder to pronounce words, which I love. I also noted a couple other things about this video. She had a really great model at 155. I don't really remember what that was because I watched this video like a couple weeks ago when I made this slide. Notice that she's prompting him to make an E sound before words that start with Y. For example, EU and ES. That's because he's making a D or an N at the beginning of those words instead of a Y. And so we want to make sure that he's easing into the word. When expanding his utterances, you'll notice that she prompts him by giving the first sound of every word. That helps him to become more independent because he has to come up with a word on his own, but is getting a prompt to know which word to say next. And as he improves, that'll be scaffolded out. And then take note of when she's taking data. So go ahead and rewatch that video. I'm going to pause here in a minute because my computer's about to die. And usually it's impossible to take data on every single thing a child says or does. Like that would require two people, like one person stimulating and the other person taking data. And that's just not realistic. So she's writing data on only the G and J sounds, which is G and ya. And so the client tends to produce the sounds on his alveolar ridge, which is the D and T sounds. And so she's taking note of when he's making the ya and the ga in comparison to those sounds. So she's working on two specific sounds. And then at 4 minutes, you can see her explaining to the client's caregiver what she is looking for as far as expanding utterances at home. This is a great summary to give at the end of sessions so parents can help carry over skills. Clients see us 1 hour a week, maybe less, maybe more, but on average, and they see their parents 24/7. So parent training is essential in promoting change, and that's why our lab has caregiver workshops because it's just so important. That's where they're going to get most of their cueing from. I'm going to go ahead and pause so I can charge my computer. I know this video is like 8 trillion years. So go ahead and watch the third video, rewatch the second video to look at these notes that I made. I wonder if oh yeah, I put some other notes here too. I'll make sure that I share this with notes so you guys can read through because there's some really great information that winter break me remembered to add in because I knew that current me would not. So I'll go ahead and pause to charge and I will meet back with you in a second. All right, we're back once again. Almost done, guys. I know this has been a long one. Let's go into video 3. So in this video, we saw a classroom of preschoolers learning math. So super cute. And so I decided to break this into 2 different slides. So the first one, I did kind of more objective data. So how many of them followed one-step directions? Or how often did the group as a general follow one-step directions? Pretty much 100% of the time. Following two-step directions only had one opportunity, but they did it. And then answers yes, no questions. No, Pippa, no, 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 Pippa. No, guys. My dog just ate my lunch. Okay, wait, give me a second. Pippa, no! What are you doing? Okay. I've been exposed for wearing shorts with my shirt too. Okay, moving on. I can't believe that just happened. Okay, answers yes, no questions. Most of them, yes. Some didn't answer group questions, but they did individually. Counts to 5, most yes, some didn't participate in it. Again, if I was taking data on a specific kid, I would specifically note if they did or did not participate. But because I didn't assign us to one kid to watch, I didn't bother to write down which ones didn't participate. Subtracts 5 minus 1, all were yes. Subtracts 4 minus 2, all were yes, except for Layla and Drew, poor kids. And then subtracts 2 minus 2, all of them were yes. And then more data, more subjective data was how many of them participated in songs using gestures. Some were yes, some were no. Using songs with words, some were yes, some were no. And again, I would specifically note which kid did it and which kid didn't if I was supposed to watch a certain kid. And then here I wrote, all students are engaged in the activity demonstrated by sustained eye contact, repetition of words and gestures throughout the song, and use of words and gestures throughout the subtraction activity with manipulatives. All students demonstrate appropriate behavior demonstrated by following directions, sitting in place with their hands in their lap, using manipulatives as asked, and answering questions when asked directly. So if I was writing a report, that is what I would write about my observational data. So you can see here that, oh, back, 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 back. Here, there's like the more objective data that even though it's just an observation, you're taking numbers, right? So you're saying, did they follow one step directions? Yes or no? And you're observing, but you're still taking objective data. And then here it's more subjective data, like did they participate in the song? That's like a yes or no, kind of. But there's more to it, right? So did they use gestures during the song? That is a clear yes or no. But if you're writing out more, like there was one boy who was sitting during the song and all the other kids were singing and he wasn't singing, but he was paying attention to the teacher. He was smiling, he was laughing, he was kind of like swaying. So he was still engaged in the activity, even if he wasn't singing or using gestures specifically. I'm so sorry for Pippa during this video, but it is what it is. I'm not re-recording this. It's been like 2 hours. Okay, so assignments this week. You're gonna watch 5 more videos, which is a lot. It seems like a lot and it is a lot. Some of them are longer than others. They're all linked on Canvas and on the next slide. And take a variety of data, similar to what we did in this activity, whatever you feel is appropriate for each video. So we might have not had similar data. You might have chosen to take data on something else. That's something you guys can talk about in your small group, is what kind of data you guys chose to take, how similar it was. And yeah, compare it with each other, and with your coaches. They have a little bit more experience than you guys, so they might have a different set of eyes. But also maybe you guys took data on the same stuff and maybe you guys had really similar data, and that's ultimately the goal, right? We even though nobody's going to have exactly the same data, we want it to be similar because that proves that it's reflective of the child and their strengths and weaknesses. So hopefully this was helpful, even though it was super long, to have me walk through different types of data, different ways to get data, how to write data when you're assessing or when you're treating a child using SOAP notes, and then walking through some actual real life examples. And of course, my dog eating my lunch was highlight of the year. So I hope you guys have a great week. I will see you next week. And I hope you guys have a good one. I will send out an email with all of the links for the slide and for the assignment. Or I'll email it and I'll also link it in Canvas so that you guys can go back and rewatch them if you need to. So I hope you guys have a great week. I'll see you next week. Bye.